Indeed, my pleasure to introduce Dr. Ed Stone. I'm going to start with an informal introduction first. Ed is a dear friend. I have come to know him and be with him over a 25-year plus period. He has treated and seen my wife, Cammie, her mother, my mother, and myself. And you really get to know someone when you go through those things together. And Ed, it's a real honor and privilege to be able to introduce you formally for those that are on this call that may have not met or got to know Ed. He is the director of the Institute for Vision Research at the University of Iowa. He is well known. In fact, he's world renowned for his work in defining the genetic basis of blinding eye disease, ranging from the two most common, macular degeneration and glaucoma, to a large number of much rarer conditions like retinitis pigmentosa and Usher syndrome. Ed is the holder of the Siemens-Hauser Chair in Molecular Ophthalmology. The Hauser, Leo Hauser, is a founding board member as well of the Institute for Vision Research. He has one of those heritable blinding eye conditions called retinitis pigmentosa. He's a major supporter of the Institution for Vision Research. I hope he's on this call. Ed is the pioneer, literally, in the world in the field of ophthalmology and genetics. He has been active 7/24/365 in removing the technical, legal, financial barriers between genetic discoveries and the patients who would benefit from them. He has founded what is known as the Institute for Vision Research today. It went through 4 or 5 other names over the 25 years we've been together. And he also, importantly, founded the Carver not-profit genetic testing laboratory, which allows for the diagnosis of a large number of heritable genetic mutated eye conditions. His current interest is in developing affordable gene and stem cell-based treatments for all forms of inherited retinal blindness, which we'll be talking about. He has co-authored close to 500 scientific papers in his career so far. I think he averages about another one a month, so that number will continue to go up. So here we have Ed Stone. Ed, you and your significant other, Dr. Mary Stone, a quite significant physician in her own right, you both grew up in the South, and you went to medical school in Texas, and you also at that time got your PhD at the same time down there. The question is, what in heaven's name happened to your mind that you would leave those places? You could go any place in the world you wanted, given who you were and the capabilities and education you had. How come you decided to come to Iowa City?
Well, first of all, Gary, thanks very much for that very nice introduction. And I'm going to find a way sometime during the hour to get the counterpart to that end back going the other direction. But to answer the question, you know, I was 28 years old, finishing my medical training at Baylor. And what you do for the last thing is you go somewhere to train in your subspecialty, do your so-called residency. And so I asked around my mentors back at Baylor what all the great programs were, and I applied to all the programs that people thought were all the great programs. And Iowa was listed among that group, but so were all the East and West Coast places that are sort of household words for august medical institutions. So I was fortunate to be invited to interview in many of those places, and I went there, and I will tell you that the difference between Iowa and every other place was just stunning. And that is that all of these other fancy places sort of met you at the door and said, "Aren't you fortunate to be interviewing here in this fancy place?" And that was a bit off-putting to me. You know, you know, had grown up in a little more humble environment, you know, and I just thought, wow, these guys think very highly of themselves. And I came to Iowa, and there were these incredibly world famous faculty members, and they were walking around with, you know, check shirts on, no tie. We wear ties today, but in those days when I was interviewing, they didn't. And talking to each other, calling each other by their first names. And it was just so apparent that they cared much more about getting the work done and getting important work done than they did about personal recognition and so forth. And I must tell you, I was sitting, one of these places I was interviewing, this lady stood up and said, "You know, most of you aren't going to be selected for a spot here today, but I just want you to know that, you know, it was an honor for you to be here." And I thought to myself, man, I wouldn't last here a week. But when I got to the University of Iowa, I felt immediately at home. I'd never been to Iowa. The chairman, at the end of the interview, you know, you go in, you're supposed to impress the chairman with your insightful question about the program. And Chuck Phelps was the chairman at the time. He said, "Do you have any questions?" I said, "Yeah. You know, has anybody died during the winter here and during the program?" And he laughed. He thought that was pretty funny. But he said, "You know, being minus 20 degrees, you got to get a lot of your work done." So that's what attracted me, was just what we now know to be the culture. I didn't think I really knew that word at the time, but the culture of Iowa was palpable. And then the other thing, being a geneticist, I wanted to study the you know, association between genes and disease. And so in order to be able to do that, you can benefit from having big families to study. And so in Houston, you'd ask somebody, "Do you have any brothers and sisters?" They go, "Yeah, I got a brother. He lives in Portland. You know, I don't like him very much." And it's like, man, how am I ever going to study anything there? You come to Iowa and you go, "Do you have any brothers and sisters?" You go, "Yeah, I got 6 of them." You go, "Really? Where do they live?" "Well, they live in the same town I do." You go, "Really? Do you think they'd be willing to, you know, let us come examine them and, you know, be part of the study?" You know, "I don't know. Let's ask them. They're out in the waiting room. They came with me to the appointment." And I'm not kidding. I mean, that's what it is. And we now have about 75,000 blood samples that we've gathered over the last 30 years. And I think maybe 6 or 7 people have said no to being invited to be part of our study. So anyway, those two things, the culture of the place, the wonderful families that live in Iowa and who they're intelligent, well-educated people, want to help society. And this turned out to just be the best place in the world to do the sort of work we do.
So, and you just used, you talked about 75,000 blood samples. Share the significance of that briefly, if you would, because it's an asset and a resource that is, I think, unmatched in the world.
Well, yeah, I think that there's no other group in the world that has a collection even 1/10 that size, and what it does is it allows you to understand the genetic causes of disease at an ever fine level of increasingly fine level of detail, meaning that in the beginning, in 30 years ago, we literally did not know what a single gene that caused an inherited eye disease was, not a single gene. Now there are over 106 genes that are known to cause one of these conditions that we're interested in. So the next level of interest is that we've noticed over the years that some family members will have disease that is more severe than their family member. And that's caused by other genes that by themselves don't actually cause the disease, but they modify the disease. So to be able to go to that next level of study, you need not just 1 or 2 samples from somebody with a rare disease. you need 50 or 100. And so we're doing a study right now on a disease called Stargardt disease that occurs in approximately 1 out of 10,000 people in the United States. And we have about 400 families with that we've collected over the years. And so that'll just give you an idea of the statistical power one would have if you have a collection like that.
Ed, if you could share it quickly, the story where you discovered in a patient a gene mutation that had never been known before. Of course, that's happened to you a lot. And when you have this 75,000 size base of patient samples, I remember you used the term, you went to the freezer and you started to look at some of those, and I think you found something very significant. I mean, you've many things, but you know what I'm referring to, I think.
Well, I think I do, but one of our major discoveries, we had studied an individual for a number of years who had traveled to different centers to try to figure out what the cause of his disease was, and all the usual things had been done by basically everybody in the world who's working on these sorts of diseases. And so we had gotten down to the whole exome level, meaning all the coding sequences of all the genes in the whole body, 20,000 different genes. And when you do that, you find dozens and dozens and dozens of genetic variations that just are the things that make us different from each other and aren't really disease causing. So we had this long laundry list of things that we were looking through, and we were sequencing each one of them separately to confirm it. And we were down about 75 down on this list. And it turned out that the next generation sequencer, because of the way it functions, had an artifact in it that made this variant look like a little nothing. But what was really there was a 353 base pair insertion into this thing. When I was trying to explain what that felt like the day we discovered it, I said it was like going to look for your wallet in between the sofa cushions in your living room and finding a rhinoceros. We thought the wallet might be in there, but we weren't expecting this big thing. Well, anyway, so we found this thing, and he had this rhinoceros on both copies of this gene, which was a little bit unusual. And so we went to the freezer, and in about 6 days studied 2,200 RP patients that had not yet had their disease gene found. And we found 20 other families that all had the same thing. And so we looked down the list of names, and they all had obviously Jewish surnames. And there are not a lot of Jewish people that live in Iowa. And so to, look down that list and see all those Jewish surnames was meaningful. And this gene turned out to be relatively rare in the general population, but it causes 35% of all the retinitis pigmentosa among Jewish people. And this mutation actually arose in the Jewish population, but before the Ashkenazi and the Sephardic branches separated. So that's just the sort of thing that, you're just going along doing your job and trying to find out what causes this individual's disease. And then it turns out that discovery actually is very important for many, many other people.
That's one of the powers of your organization, and having 75,000 samples from literally around the world. Ed, you were one of the first molecular ophthalmologists in the world. If there's some civilians like me on this call, you might give them a couple sentences on what a molecular ophthalmologist is. But how's that field changed since you came to Iowa almost 35 years ago?
Well, as I mentioned, in the early day, some of the terms that most people are familiar with, like cloning of DNA and DNA sequencing and things like that. Those technologies were just starting to hit medicine in the late 1970s and early 1980s. So the very, very first genetic test for any kind of disease was really happening right at the beginning of the 1980s when I came to Iowa to do my training. So in those days, those of us who had combined training in molecular biology and ophthalmology would all fit in my Volvo with one of the seats left over for the dog. And all we wanted to do was like somehow like find one of the genes that caused one of these diseases or something. And so the early days were just that. We went out looking for large families where a number of people were affected with one of these diseases, and we would use the statistical power of those families and some of the early molecular technologies to find the genes, and that's what we did. That was just establishing the framework, if you will, of the field. We didn't really realize that at the time. We were just doing what we knew how to do. And then about, say 10 or 12 years into that, we had a whole list of genes that had been discovered. And I remember I was sitting at this desk that I'm sitting at right now, as a matter of fact, and I was typing a grant application and I was justifying the grant, and I basically said, and then if we can find the gene, then it will help us get to the treatment faster. And I sort of sat back in my chair and I said, well, that's true, but how exactly are we going to do that? And I remember, having this palpable shift in my thinking that it was, we no longer had the luxury of just finding genes, but we needed to start really working on the mechanics of how we were going to deliver gene-based therapy based upon these findings. And so there was about a decade of that, culminating in the first successful gene therapy for an inherited retinal disease that was led by our friends at the University of Pennsylvania, Gene Bennett and Al McGuire, successfully treated this disease called Leber congenital amaurosis. And so then the next phase, as that sort of became commercialized and it became apparent that the commercial strategy for these diseases was going to come in at something like $1 million a patient or more, we realized that we had to, find a way to convert this successful technology into something that somebody could be able to afford. And so that's when we realized that we needed to make our own manufacturing facility here at the University of Iowa so we could offer these treatments in a nonprofit structure. And then kind of the last big thing was, well, what about all the people that have already lost a lot of their vision? Putting a new gene into an injured retina isn't going to bring that vision back. And so a few years, let's say about 2004 to 2007, right in there, stem cell therapy kinds of things were in their early phases. And then there was this breakthrough in Japan in which Japanese scientists learned how to make embryonic-like cells out of a patient's own skin. And that just completely changed the environment, because now there was no more ethical concerns about embryonic tissue. There were no longer any immunologic concerns about the tissue maybe being rejected. And so then the whole landscape sort of became apparent what we needed to do. We needed to have low-cost genetic testing like the Carver nonprofit genetic testing laboratory. We had to make gene therapy for basically every known inherited retinal disease. And we had to do that in a nonprofit way to keep the costs down. And then for people that had already lost their vision, we needed to be able to make stem cell-based transplants to restore vision. And that's really how it's changed. We went from not a single gene known 30 years ago to being able to make little sheets of living human retina out of stem cells that are derived from a patient's own body.
And one of the things that always really struck a chord with me is you mentioned earlier the over 100 known gene mutations, but so many of these are in what would be called relatively small number of patients, and you get in a situation where I think the U.S. Gee, really, I don't need that. You get in a situation where you've got maybe 200,000 patients that have the condition. A commercial entity is not going to focus on that because there's not money to be made unless it's $1 million plus per patient. And so one of the things that I found so powerful about what you've done is, and are doing, is the focus on these rare, if you will, called rare conditions. And I remember you saying individually they're rare, collectively they're common. And so I think that's a really key part of what you're doing. In terms of what you're doing, how important is the philanthropic support for getting this done? Because if you've got these conditions where commercial entities aren't going to be interested in it because of the economics, what's the role that philanthropy plays in the IVR?
Well, philanthropy is absolutely essential to what we do. Currently, philanthropy is at least 50% of our total annual budget. And the reason for that is that these kinds of things, like if you say, I want to make a nonprofit manufacturing facility for gene therapy. Well, a granting agency doesn't think that sounds like research. That sounds like some business enterprise that ought to be funded in a venture capital sort of way. The problem with the venture capital mechanism for that is that one has to be constantly concerned about protecting the intellectual property of this, that, and the other thing to deliver this expensive product at the end to pay everybody back for their investment. And if one has the luxury of having philanthropy, then you can just give all of your knowledge away as you're doing it. So when you make a discovery, you can publish one of these papers that you talked about earlier. And one day somebody asked me about that, and they said, aren't you afraid that somebody's going to steal this idea from you? And it just so flummoxed me, because I said, well, that would be like stealing my lawnmower and mowing my lawn, right? In other words, we're trying to cure these diseases. So if somehow we put something in a paper or showed somebody how to do something such that they ran home and made these treatments and delivered them less expensively than we could deliver them, thereby putting us out of business, we win, right? So it's really philanthropy that makes that all possible. And coming back to your very nice introduction, I'll just tell the people on the call that, were it not for Gary Siemens and his wife Cami and Leo Hauser, who's already been named, and a number of other advisory board members, Marty Carver and the whole Carver family, who have been so generous to us over the years, the Institute for Vision Research at the University of Iowa would not exist. And in the original initial board meeting that we had, where we had 4 advisory boards, we were all sitting around a little table. And in that first meeting, we were discussing whether or not we thought we could raise $40,000. And Gary interrupted the conversation and said, wait. I think we need to think more in terms of $7 to $10 million. Okay. And everybody looked at him like he was crazy. But in the last 10 years, we've raised over $100 million. And that was Gary's vision and his wife's terrific generosity that created the first endowed chair in the Institute and a number of other things. So anyway, philanthropy is hugely important. We couldn't do any of the work we do without it. And Gary has certainly been a leader in that over the years, not just with us, but also in the engineering department, as you heard earlier.
And one of the things I think that makes you so unique, and I'm not trying to embarrass you here, but people of your accomplishment and renown typically are competing against some other person, some other institution, something other than what you are driven by. And I think it's so important that you and your team are competing against the disease, not against something else. And so all the things you just talked about, where you share the information and your whole approach, it's not for personal recognition, it's not for renown, it's because you're competing against the disease. And you use the terms, we win. Yeah, we win when the diseases are defeated. And I think that's remarkable. You just don't see it in the world, the human nature for renown or whatever, and hats off to you. You know,
let me just interrupt you though, Gary, because I feel a little guilty whenever anybody talks like that, because it is true that we compete against blindness and ignorance in the scientific field, and not against each other and not against other organizations. But what I tell my junior colleagues is, you don't lose anything with that strategy. Okay, so in other words, you know, I've done okay in the personal recognition department. It's just interesting that if you focus on the disease, the other follows. The other follows. You don't have to worry about whether somebody's going to recognize you or not if you just go in there and do your job every day. And that was the miracle of the Iowa program, right? That was this culture that I felt. The person who was chair just before I matched here in Iowa was a man named Fred Blody, who had been born in Austria, escaped Europe during World War II. He spoke 10 or 11 languages, translated all the original ophthalmic works from German to English. And this guy was sitting here in the middle of Iowa because this was where he could get his international work done. He was ridiculously famous. And yet, as I was walking down the hall the first week I was here, he stopped me and he said, Ed, I heard that Mary had a cold. Is she feeling better? So not only did this person know my name the first week I was here, he knew my wife's name, and he knew that she had been ill. So so what Iowa figured out, this program figured out, and I think the whole institution figured out, is if you focus on the mission, the other will follow. And so a lot of people figured that out long before I did. I just have been the beneficiary of being immersed in that culture in my career. And what I would tell the junior people is you're not giving anything away when you do that culture, because you'll do fine personally if you just jump in there and work really hard.
Ed, we talk about the Institute for Vision Research. I know its predecessor organization started with a quantity of one, you. How has it grown over the years?
Well, our first a couple of years, I wrote a little grant as a first-year resident, and it was $19,000. So that first year, our entire operating budget was $19,000. Everybody was a volunteer. We had medical students and so forth, just helping out, going on these road trips and everything. And we just bought, you know, blood tubes and needles and things like that with our $19,000. A few years later, we hired our first full-time employee, who's Luann Streb, and Luann has been at the university almost 35 years now, and working with us for 30 of those 35 years. Then we had a little lab that had you know, 5, 6 people in it for several years. Had a lot of good work there. My partner, Val Sheffield, came to the University of Iowa, an incredible molecular geneticist and pediatrician, and he brought a whole lot of molecular capability that we didn't have at the time. And so I sort of brought the ophthalmology and he brought the molecular genetics. And now the organization has over 100 people in it, working in you know, almost 30,000 square feet of space. And so we went from an 800 square foot room and $19,000 or so to more than 30,000 square feet of space, more than 100 people, and more than $10 million a year of budget.
So you're not only a brilliant scientist, but you're a patient-seeing clinician scientist. When you get a patient for the first time, and you're talking to them about the keys to curing retinal blindness, what would you tell them are those keys?
Well, several of these things we've already touched on. I think the first thing that's absolutely true is high quality genetic testing. So, you know, in order to use any form of gene therapy, you actually have to know exactly what gene is causing the problem or the treatment won't work. When you put new stem cells into a person's retina, you want to correct the abnormal gene in those cells if you derive the cells from the person so the disease won't recur. And then there are also things like, you know, dominant diseases and X-linked diseases could recur in the family. And so you want to have high quality genetic testing so that you can potentially forestall disease in other family members. So the genetic testing is super important. The next thing is thinking of all the diseases as one thing. But, you know, one is tempted to work on one of the diseases. One is tempted to do that. But the barriers to, you know, creating the manufacturing facility, getting it all through the FDA, rounding up the doctors who are going to administer the treatment and all that, doing that with one small disease, you can't muster the support that you need in order to do that. So I think it's really key to have a leave no one behind kind of mentality and take what you learn from one disease and apply it to the next. And then the other thing is that is to leave no one behind early and late disease. So in other words, in the future, I hope it's true that a young person will come in with very little injury to their retina, will have good diagnosis, will know what they have very early on, and we can put gene therapy into the retina and slow down or stop the disease so they never lose a significant amount of their disease, of their vision. But for now and a number of years to go, we have a bunch of people in the world who've already lost their vision, and so we can't leave them behind either. So we have to have that restorative treatment as part of the dimension. So leave no one behind across all the genes, leave no one behind across all of the severities. And then the thing that we that touched on, you got to do it all very, very inexpensively in order for it to be widely available. And the cool thing is that with the facilities that we already have built here at the university, I think it's very realistic that we would be able to deliver gene therapy, including the genetic diagnosis, including the surgery, including 10 years of follow-up. I think we can do that for about $20,000 a person. And the stem cell therapy, because it's more complicated, will be a bit more expensive, but maybe something on the order of $50,000. And if we can get those costs down to that level, then these treatments will be widely available in the world.
Ed, I'm always struck by the difficulty that all of this involves, you know, and the notion of leaving no one behind. That's, you start with, you know, younger people that have a genetic defect that causes their condition. Gosh, it sounds simple, gene therapy, right? But is it a bad gene? Is it a gene that's not working hard enough? Is it one working too hard? And that gene therapy, what you have to do, it's a really complex thing. And the progress you and your team have made is just extraordinary. And to be able, I remember one of the cultures in all the years we've been together is the idea of realistic hope. Realistic hope. And I think that's so powerful. The time between, you know, finding all the things that need to be done, sharing them, communicating like you are here, and the idea of giving people hope. You know, it's kind of like the last few days where people have been getting COVID shots. You know, the end of the pandemic isn't over yet, but I think you're further along.
Well, I think the concept of realistic hope is a really important one to think about. You know, it's challenging because you don't want to overpromise a treatment to a patient, and because, you know, that would be hurtful and it would put a lot of pressure on everybody. But on the other hand, you don't want to underpromise the treatment, right? So if you know in 2020 that right now you can take a little piece of skin from somebody, turn that into living human photoreceptor precursor cells, you can put those onto a dissolvable polymer, you can roll that up into a little specially made instrument and push that little piece of retina through a hole in a eye of a pig, which has the same size eye as a human, and unroll that thing on the other side. And you know that all that stuff exists right now. Well, why would you turn to a patient and say, there's nothing we can do? Okay. See, so I wondered, I just wondered for the first 10 or 15 years of my career, like, why, given all this progress, would someone ever say that to a person? And I realized that what was really happening is, if you tell somebody there's nothing that can be done, you have not engaged, right? You're not responsible anymore because, you know, they don't have to come back. But, you know, you don't want to hear that. You want to hear that there is something that will eventually be able to be done, and you would like to hear the steps that someone is going to follow. And so the concept of realistic hope is to have a plan, a realistic plan with the people who actually can deliver that thing. And this is the most important part, a group of people who are committed to working on it until it succeeds. And, you know, what we say all the time is we're going to keep working on it until it works for us or it works for somebody else. And if it works for somebody else, I will happily put my patient in the car and drive them over to the other person to get the treatment. But, you know, we're going to work on it until it works, either us or elsewhere.
You know, Ed, I'm going to want to entertain any participants' questions here in just a minute. But what you just said, I would share with the participants on this call. And I've told you this before, Ed, that God put you on this earth for this mission. And I'm struck by the fact that way back, when you were in medical school and you decided to do your PhD, you knew what your life's work was going to be. And when you came up to Iowa, You weren't going to come up and try and figure out, well, what kind of research should I do here besides seeing patients and all that. You knew what you were going to do. You didn't know how to do it all then. You still don't know how to do it all, but man, have you come miles and miles. And I think this university, this Carver College of Medicine, the patients around the world will always know this was your reason for living and being on this earth and your passion. The one thing I do want to add, early in the introduction, it was mentioned that Ed sits in the endowed IVR Siemens Hauser director's chair. The fact is that the day Ed is not in that chair, and I hope that's a long way away or a short way between finding all the cures and treatments, it will be known as the Ed Stone Chair. And someone who has done for this planet the kinds of things that you're doing, and literally the promise of restoring vision. I've said it before, it's been 2,000 years since that happened on this planet. And that's going to happen while you're in that chair. And I think it's going to be a very special honor for those that follow you to be in a chair that has your name on it. So.
Well, Gary, I have to respond to that. I feel very uncomfortable about all that kind of language, but really, this is very important. I'm the beneficiary the other way around, and you're right. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do or how I was going to do it. And I tell the patients all the time, where do you think the energy comes from for all of this? Where do you think the energy comes from? The energy comes from the patients themselves. So every time you're in a room with someone who's losing their vision, or their child is losing their vision, it becomes so apparent what it is that has to be done, right? So whatever obstacle there is, and there are a bunch of them, as you know, there are a bunch of them today, there were a bunch of them 10 years ago, there'll be a bunch of them 10 years from now. But whatever obstacles there are, they actually don't matter when you're in the room with the patient, because there is no alternative but to push forward to overcome this thing. So again, I and my other colleagues in the IVR are the great beneficiaries of that terrific energy that comes from all the patients who come to us believing that we're going to ultimately help them. And so anyway, it's been my pleasure and privilege to be here in this great university around all these other terrific colleagues, and with the great patients and their energy that has really fueled this work. And I agree with you. It is going to happen. We are going to see it done. So Ed, I think I do want to leave the remaining time for questions. As those questions come forward to the participants, if they have them, when they have them, I know that you have patients that have come seen you from all 50 states. I've lost count of the number of countries on this planet where patients have come to see you. Is there a current number for the number of countries? A number of countries. I don't know. I don't have a current number. More than a dozen. Yeah, I think it's actually more than 50. So, all right. Questions from participants of the man that knows what he's talking about, which is Ed Stone. Oh, here's one. How many years away do you feel you are from both gene and stem cell therapy, for those who have lost most of their vision? Well, the first thing I would say is that that's stem cell therapy. So gene therapy will not really impact someone who has lost most of their vision. So the restoring vision is mostly a stem cell thing. Um, the technology to deliver stem cells to the human eye already exists, and many on the call know that various stem cell studies are already underway around the world. The difference is that the thing that we're doing that has not been done in people yet is we're making the photoreceptor cells from the patients themselves, and that's this induced pluripotent stem cell on a dissolvable polymer technology. It's very far along. The phrase that I use to underpromise and overdeliver is single-digit years, meaning it's not just going to be a year from now, or we would already have approvals and things like that. We would know that to be true, but I think it's going to be well less than 10 years. We'll start by putting these grafts into completely blind people. We'll do that for two reasons. The first is so that we don't injure a sighted eye with an unproven technology. But the second is so that we can be confident that the stem cells are actually doing what we're observing. So if, for example, you had a person that still, could see 20/40, and you were just trying to improve their visual field a little bit or something, and you put a little piece of artificial retina in there, maybe that change in their visual field you observed was from the stem cells, and maybe they just performed the visual field better that day. If you put a 5 mm graft into a completely blind person, and they get back the ability to see light, see the edge of a door, count your fingers or something like that, then there is no question that that came from the graft that you put in. So we'll start with completely blind people. We'll tweak the grafts until they're safe and they work reasonably well. And then we'll work our way, up, if you will, to more sighted people, just like any other medical technology. So the first heart transplant, you wouldn't put a heart transplant in 1967 in somebody unless they were going to die in 15 days. Now you do a heart transplant for exercise intolerance. So the same thing, you'll start with these stem cell treatments for people with very poor vision, and then work your way up, ideally, to be able to actually restore visual field in people that have very good vision. But I think the initial treatments will be certainly more than a year from now, but definitely less than 10 years.
Ed, I've been struck over the years, like so much in medicine and science, people have different ideas for different reasons on how to do some of these things. I think the IVR at Iowa has got an approach of how to do this that maybe are there others that are following your exact same approach of induced pluripotent stem cells, of gene and stem cell therapy, leave no one behind, share everything? To me, I think if you'd comment on how important you see the strategy of replacing parts with the people's parts. This is not putting a Ford carburetor on a Dodge car. And I think the idea or the strategy you have, maybe you could just reinforce it a bit, because to my knowledge, it's pretty unique.
Well, we've certainly been the beneficiaries of scientists around the world. I mentioned earlier the discovery of the induced pluripotent stem cell was Shinya Yamanaka, a Japanese scientist, and many of the other component technologies that we're taking advantage of for our strategy were developed by others, and we're the beneficiaries of that. But let's just take making a graft for the patient themselves. What's the advantage of that? The advantage of that is it's your tissue, and there will be a much smaller chance of rejection because it's your tissue that's being transplanted. What's the disadvantage? You have to make a completely separate product, so to speak, for every single patient. And that is a tremendous manufacturing challenge to be able to do that. We think that it's worth it. We think that immunologic benefit is worth it. And so we have gone down this whole pathway of robot-assisted stem cell development and things like that to make that possible. Other people believe that the immunologic reaction can be controlled, and they're going down a more one stem cell product fits multiple people kind of model. I've made this point in different ways multiple times today. I favor the make the cells for the patients themselves, because I think there's a lot of transplant literature that would support that. But if I'm wrong about that, and someone can make the unmatched stuff work and make it work faster than we can make ours work, and they can deliver it inexpensively to patients, I'll introduce the person at the award ceremony, So it's at the moment, we're committed to the matched strategy because of our reading of the transplant literature. And we'll see, we'll see who is able to deliver these things inexpensively enough that they can get there. As far as the inexpensive gene therapy thing, to my knowledge, we are sort of the only people trying to make batches of gene therapy very inexpensively and distributing it widely. Similarly, just looking at medical economics, I don't think large numbers of people are going to get those treatments unless we can drive the costs down. So again, we have an idea about that. We're pushing that idea. We haven't gotten it done yet. So, there are different ways to think about it.
Ed, one of the participant questions was, what are some of those keys to get the costs down, both in the stem cell and the gene therapy?
Well, one of them is developing it in a philanthropic model. So, for example, you manufacture these things under conditions that are known as good manufacturing practices. Boy, is there a lot under that little acronym. It turns out it's really expensive to make a GMP facility. We built ours with philanthropic money, so we own it and aren't paying any debt service on that. And so having your own GMP manufacturing facility that was built for you by philanthropists is a key. The other key is to use open source components. So in other words, everything that we use for all of our manufacturing and everything is off the shelf stuff that anybody could use. We're at a public university where we work in beautiful facilities that were built for us by the citizens of the state of Iowa. So that's a terrific advantage. And then the last one is distributing the costs of all these things over a whole bunch of diseases. So again, if you were going to build this whole organization to treat one collection of patients, that there might be only 50 people in the United States with this disease, there's no way you can make that really inexpensive. But if you're going to distribute it across tens of thousands of doses of treatment, distributed across 100 different genes, there is a huge economy of scale there.
Ed, I think we've got time probably for one last participant question. This participant's question was, do you see the end game being a patient receiving both gene therapy and stem cell therapy roughly at the same time to achieve a maximum result?
Certainly there will be patients who receive both. So ideally, the gene therapy would be so efficacious that you would treat the person early enough with a tremendously efficacious gene therapy and they would never need stem cells. But there will be people that the gene therapy will only slow the disease down and not stop it, and so they'll need stem cells. Or there will be people whose disease is far enough along that the gene therapy simply won't abrogate their disease, and they'll need stem cells. But the mixture of the two in certain patients, I think, will happen.
Well, Ed, there's no question it will happen. And under your leadership, we all owe you. We didn't get a chance to talk to about your 110 people going, but they're amazing people to the person. And it's been a real pleasure getting to know them as well. I would like to close out the meeting by thanking all the participants and all those that attended. There will be an email sent by Katie to all those people that attended, and with links and contacts for questions, and hopefully some of the participants will join us in the support of this effort, because it's just so rewarding. Ed, thank you and the team for all you do. It's been a pleasure, and I look for the next 25 years together.
Well, Gary, let me add my thanks both to you for agreeing to moderate the session, and for all of your terrific support over the many years that we've been together. I want to thank all the people who took time to listen to us yak today, and I feel very fortunate to be at this great university that's been so supportive of our work for 3 decades now. So thanks to all of you, and we'll look forward to your questions emailing in.
God bless and Godspeed. Thank you all.